At 0933 hours on the 2nd of September 1944, USS Finback receives a radio message. Aircraft down. Pilot in the water. The Gado-class submarine is on lifeguard duty 15 miles south of Chi-Chi Jima. Commander Robert Williams orders the boat to periscope depth. 2 F-6F Hellcat fighters circle overhead. They are the chickens, as submariners call them, the escorts that keep Japanese patrol boats away from downed pilots. At 1156 hours, Williams spots a yellow raft through the periscope. 9 miles from shore, a single figure sits in it. The figure is paddling frantically away from Chi-Chi Jima. Behind him, Japanese boats are leaving the harbor. The Hellcats dive on the boats. The boats turn back. Finback surfaces. 5 sailors stand ready on the forward deck. Torpedo man First Class Donald Kohler reaches down. He grabs the exhausted pilot's hand. The other sailors hold Kohler. They yank the pilot aboard. He is soaked. He is bleeding from his forehead. He is vomiting seawater. He is 20 years old. Happy to be aboard, he says. Lieutenant Junior Grade, George Herbert Walker. Bush has just been rescued from the Pacific Ocean. He will spend the next month aboard Finback as part of the crew. He will stand watch. He will help rescue other pilots. He will experience depth charge attacks that terrify him more than flying through anti-aircraft fire. 44 years later, he will become the 41st President of the United States. The submarine crew that pulled him from the water will walk in his inauguration parade. But on this morning, he is simply another Zoomy, another downed aviator, another name on Finback's rescue log. The submarine's guns destroy his raft. Evidence must not remain for Japanese patrol boats to find. Finback submerges. Williams turns the boat away from Chi-Chi Jima. Bush goes below. Someone gives him dry clothes. Someone gives him brandy. He sits in the wardroom and tries to understand that his 2 crewmen are dead. He does not yet know which one bailed out with him. He does not yet know whose parachute failed to open. He does not yet know if it was John Delaney or Ted White who fell to his death. He will never know for certain. Both men are gone. Bush flew 58 combat missions during the war. This is the one that defines his service. This is the one that nearly kills him. This is the one that saves him. USS San Jacinto was not supposed to be an aircraft carrier. She was supposed to be a cruiser. Light cruiser Newark. Hull number CL100. Laid down at New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey on October 26, 1942. But by then, the Navy had already decided Newark would not be a cruiser. She would be a carrier. The conversion was ordered before her keel was laid. The decision came from the top. President Franklin Roosevelt had been asking questions in August 1941. The Navy planned no new fleet carriers before 1944. The war was coming. Everyone knew it. The big Essex-class carriers would take years to build. What could be done faster? What hulls were already under construction? What could be converted? The General Board of the United States Navy studied the problem. On October 13, 1941, they reported back. Converting cruiser hulls to carriers would result in too many compromises. The ships would be ineffective. The fine lines of cruiser hulls would not accommodate a proper hangar. The island would be too small. The elevators would be poorly positioned. The forward flight deck would lack adequate support. The ships would be unstable. The board recommended against the conversion. Roosevelt ordered another study. On October 25, 1941, the Bureau of Ships reported that carriers converted from cruiser hulls would be of lesser capability, but they would be available much sooner. Speed mattered. Capability could be compromised for availability. The Navy could build makeshift carriers in a year or wait 3 years for proper carriers. War does not wait. Pearl Harbor settled the argument. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked. The need for carriers became urgent. The Navy accelerated construction of the Essex class simultaneously. In January 1942, they reordered Cleveland-class light cruiser Amsterdam as an aircraft carrier. The design showed more promise than expected. In February, 2 more cruisers were reordered as carriers. In March, 3 more. In June, 3 more. 9 Cleveland-class cruisers would become 9 Independence-class light carriers. The conversion was brutal to the original design. The cruiser hull remained largely intact. Length 622 feet 6 inches. Original beam 71 feet 6 inches. But stability demanded modification. The hangar and flight deck added tremendous topside weight. To compensate, blisters were welded to the hull amidships, adding 5 feet to the beam. The final beam measured 109 feet. Even with blisters, The ships were dangerously top-heavy. They rolled heavily in any sea state. They pitched violently in storms. Pacific typhoons nearly capsized them. Draft measured 26 feet. Standard displacement was 11,000 long tons. Full load displacement reached 14,750 long tons, though some sources list 15,100 long tons depending on fuel and ammunition load. 4 boilers fed General Electric geared turbines producing 100,000 shaft horsepower to 4 shafts. Maximum speed was 31.6 knots, slightly slower than the Cleveland cruisers they were based on. The added topside weight cost speed. But 31 knots was fast enough to operate with the Fast Carrier Task Force. That mattered more than the lost half knot. Range was 13,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. Crew complement was 1,549 officers and enlisted, including the air group. Armament was entirely defensive. 26 Bofors 40mm guns in various mounts. 40 Oerlikon 20mm autocannon. Later, some ships received additional Bofors mounts. The light carriers had no offensive armament beyond their aircraft. They relied on screening vessels for protection against surface threats. The flight deck measured 550 feet long, 73 feet wide at its widest point. Compare this to an Essex-class carrier. Essex flight decks were 862 feet long, 108 feet wide. The difference is stark. Landing on an Independence-class carrier was dangerous. The deck was narrow. The ship rolled heavily. Accident rates on the light carriers exceeded those on Essex-class carriers by significant margins. Pilots called the CVLS widowmakers. Rookie pilots were assigned to Essex-class carriers when possible. The CVLs kept experienced pilots who understood the difficulty of the smaller deck. 2 aircraft elevators served the hangar. One was positioned aft of the island, forward on the flight deck. This elevator brought armed and fueled aircraft directly from the hangar to the catapults. The second elevator was positioned aft, approximately 50 meters from the stern. 2 hydraulic catapults were installed forward. They could launch aircraft as large as the SB-2C Helldiver. They could not catapult 2 Avengers simultaneously. The gap between catapults was insufficient for the Avenger's wingspan. The hangar was a compromise. It was narrow, following the width of the original cruiser hull. It was short. It had low overhead clearance. Larger aircraft like the SBD Dauntless could not fold their wings tightly enough to fit. The Dauntless was quickly dropped from CVL air groups. The air group composition standardized around the F-6F Hellcat fighter and the TBF or TBM Avenger torpedo bomber. 24 Hellcats, 9 Avengers, total of 33 aircraft. Some carriers carried up to 45 aircraft by using deck parks. Compare this to an Essex-class air group. Essex carriers routinely operated 90 aircraft. They could surge to over 100. The Independence class carried 1/3 the striking power, but striking power was not the only metric. The light carriers could keep up with the fast carriers. They could operate aircraft in weather that grounded escort carriers. They provided additional flight decks for the task force when Essex-class carriers were hit, when their decks were damaged. CVL decks could recover their aircraft. When kamikaze attacks saturated defenses, the dispersed fleet with more carriers presented more targets but also more redundancy. Newark became CV-30 on June 2, 1942. She was renamed Reprisal on June 23, 1942. Her name was changed again on January 6, 1943. She became San Jacinto, named for the battle that won Texas independence from Mexico in 1836. Citizens of Houston raised $85 million for her construction and for a replacement for the recently sunk heavy cruiser USS Houston. Mary Gibbs Jones, wife of Commerce Secretary Jesse Holman Jones, sponsored the ship. San Jacinto was launched September 26, 1943. She was commissioned November 15, 1943. Captain Harold Martin took command. On July 15, 1943, while still under construction, San Jacinto and her sisters were reclassified. The designation changed from CV to CVL, small aircraft carrier. The Navy acknowledged what they were. They were not fleet carriers. They were light carriers, compromised, limited, available. San Jacinto departed Philadelphia Navy Yard on January 17, 1944, wearing Measure 33 design 7A camouflage, light gray with darker gray geometric patterns. 4 smoke funnels lined up along the starboard side aft of the island. The funnels were distinctive. The island was small, resembling escort carrier islands more than fleet carrier islands. The sharp cruiser bow remained visible. The hull blisters were obvious, bulging outboard of the straight-sided hangar. She transited to Norfolk, Virginia. She embarked Air Group 51. On February 7th, she steamed to Trinidad for shakedown cruise. The shakedown revealed problems. The flight deck was too narrow. Aircraft handling was difficult. The deck crews developed new procedures. Aircraft could not be maneuvered as freely as on larger carriers. Every movement required planning. The hangar was cramped. Maintenance was complicated by limited space. The ship rolled heavily even in moderate seas. Landing signal officers had to account for the roll when bringing aircraft aboard. Pilots had to time their approach to the ship's motion. In April, San Jacinto transited the Panama Canal. She steamed to Pearl Harbor. On May 9th, she rendezvoused with Task Force 58 at Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Her first combat operations involved combat air patrol and anti-submarine patrol, supporting strikes against Marcus Island and Wake Island. On May 23rd, San Jacinto's aircraft struck Wake. No combat casualties occurred. One Avenger was lost when it failed to return from anti-submarine patrol. The crew was listed as missing. By June 5, 1944, San Jacinto was ready for major combat. Task Force 58 sortied from Majuro heading for the Marianas. The mission was to conduct strikes preparatory to the invasion of Saipan and to protect invasion forces from Japanese air and naval attack. This would be the largest fleet action since Midway. On June 19th, the Japanese fleet launched over 400 aircraft against the invasion fleet. American fighters intercepted. The resulting air battle became known to pilots as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down. San Jacinto's fighters and anti-aircraft gunners contributed. San Jacinto's guns helped down attackers that penetrated the fighter screen. One Japanese carrier plane reportedly attempted to land on San Jacinto. The landing signal officer waved it off because its hook was not down. The pilot realized his error and fled. The Marianas operation validated the CVL concept. More flight decks meant more fighters for combat air patrol. More decks meant dispersed targets. More decks meant redundancy when carriers were damaged. San Jacinto operated continuously with the Fast Carrier Task Force through July. From July 17th to 21st, she provided combat air patrols, anti-submarine patrols, and strikes against Japanese positions on Guam. On July 24th, Ensign George Herbert Walker Bush flew a photo reconnaissance mission over Palau Islands in the Western Carolines. Operation Snapshot. Bush and his crew photographed Japanese installations. They produced 1,017 photographs. During this mission, Bush shared credit with Lieutenant Roland Houle for sinking a Japanese armed trawler in Kayangal Lagoon. Babaltuap. Bush had reported aboard San Jacinto in February 1944. He was assigned to Torpedo Squadron 51 as photographic officer. He was one of the youngest pilots in the squadron. He had enlisted in the Naval Reserve on his 18th birthday. June 12, 1942, he completed flight training at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Texas. He was commissioned ensign on June 9, 1943, 3 days before his 19th birthday. For a time, he was considered the youngest aviator in naval aviation. He flew the Grumman TBM Avenger. The TBM was the naval designation for Avengers built by General Motors. The TBF was built by Grumman. They were identical aircraft with different manufacturers. The Avenger was the largest single-engine aircraft in World War II. Length 40 feet 11 inches. Wingspan 54 feet 2 inches. Height 16 feet 5 inches. Empty weight 10,545 pounds. Maximum gross weight 17,895 pounds. Wright Cyclone 14 radial engine producing 1,900 horsepower. Maximum speed 275 miles per hour. Range 1,130 miles with a torpedo. 2,530 miles with external fuel tanks. The Avenger carried a crew of 3. Pilot in the forward cockpit. Radio operator in the fuselage. Manning the radio and operating the ventral gun position. Turret gunner in the dorsal turret with a 50 caliber machine gun. The aircraft carried one Mark 13 torpedo or 4 500-pound bombs internally. 2 additional bombs or drop tanks could be mounted externally under the wings. The Avenger also carried one 50 caliber machine gun in each wing and one 30 caliber machine gun in the ventral position. It was a powerful aircraft. It was also vulnerable. The Avenger was large and relatively slow. It presented a substantial target. During dive bombing attacks, the aircraft had to make steep dives to release bombs accurately. During these dives, the Avenger was exposed to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft could absorb significant damage and continue flying. But direct hits to the engine or fuel tanks were often fatal. On August 4th and 5th, San Jacinto participated in Operation Scavenger, strikes against Iwo Jima and the Bonin Islands. The strikes prepared for eventual invasion. Task Force 58 retired to Eniwetok Atoll to replenish. While there, Tactical Command transferred to Commander 3rd Fleet. Task Force 58 became Task Force 38. Task Force 38 returned to operations. On September 1st and 2nd, the force conducted strikes against Iwo Jima, Chi-Chi Jima, and Ha-Ha Jima in the Bonin Islands. September 2nd was the day George Bush's war changed. At dawn, San Jacinto launched strikes. Bush led a flight of 4 Avengers from Torpedo Squadron 51. The target was a radio communication station on Chi-Chi Jima. The island was heavily fortified. Over 20,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors garrisoned the island. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the coastline and covered the interior. Chi-Chi Jima served as a communications hub and resupply point. The radio station was a priority target. Bush's crew consisted of Lieutenant Junior Grade William Ted White as substitute gunner and aviation radio man, Second Class John Lawson Delaney as radio operator. White was substituting for Bush's regular gunner. Each Avenger carried 4 500-pound bombs. The flight joined 8 Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers from Bombing Squadron 20 from USS Enterprise, 12 F-6F Hellcat fighters from Fighting Squadron 20, also from Enterprise. Provided escort, the formation approached Chi-Chi Jima. Anti-aircraft fire erupted. Heavy, accurate fire. Bush's Avenger was hit. The engine caught fire. Flames spread along the wing, creasing toward the fuel tanks. Smoke poured into the cockpit. Bush continued the attack. He had been trained to complete his run regardless of obstacles. He dove. He opened the bomb bay doors. He released his bombs over the target. The bombs struck. The radio station was damaged. The tower was destroyed. Bush turned toward open water. He told his crew to bail out. The aircraft was burning. The fire was spreading. They needed to get out. Bush flew several miles from the island. The engine was still running. Flames streamed from the wing. At approximately 0900 hours, Bush bailed out. The parachute deployed. Bush struck his head on the tail of the aircraft during his exit. His forehead was gashed. Part of his parachute was torn, but the chute opened. He descended into the Pacific. One other parachute deployed from the aircraft. This parachute did not fully open. It was a streamer, a partially deployed chute that does not slow the descent. The man fell to his death. Bush hit the water. He inflated his life raft. He climbed in. He began paddling away from Chi-Chi Jima. He was 9 miles from shore. Japanese patrol boats left the harbor moving toward him. 2 Hellcat fighters circled overhead. They strafed the patrol boats. The boats turned back. Bush searched the water for his crewmen. He saw no one. He paddled. He vomited from swallowing seawater. He was stung by jellyfish. He wept. He continued paddling away from the island. The fighters continued circling. They transmitted his position to any submarines on lifeguard duty. USS Finback was on station. The Gato-class submarine had been assigned lifeguard duty during strikes on the Bonin Islands. Lifeguard duty was common for submarines in 1944. By mid-1944, Japanese shipping targets had become scarce. Submarines were positioned near strike targets to rescue downed pilots. The submarines had areas of 200 to 300 square miles to patrol. They monitored radio traffic. They watched for aircraft going down. When pilots hit the water, the submarines went to get them. Finback had rescued 3 aviators the day before during strikes on Iwo Jima. On September 2nd, Commander Williams received Bush's position. He moved the boat toward the coordinates. At 1156 hours, Williams spotted Bush through the periscope. The submarine surfaced. The rescue was captured on 8mm film by Finback's officer of the deck. The film later found its way to Congressman Bush years later. It was shown at the Republican National Convention. Bush spent 30 days aboard Finback. He was put to work immediately. 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off. He stood lookout duty with the other rescued aviators. They helped ensure enemy aircraft and submarines did not approach undetected. Finback patrolled on the surface during the day when possible and always at night to recharge batteries. When enemy aircraft forced the submarine to dive, the aviators cursed just like the submariners. Bush experienced what submariners lived with constantly. The boat was depth charged twice during his time aboard. Bush found it terrifying. He had thought flying into anti-aircraft fire was frightening. Being depth-charged was worse. In an aircraft, he could take evasive action. He could fight back. In a submarine, he could only sit and wait. The tension was unbearable. The submariners seemed unconcerned. The aviators hated it. Bush witnessed Finback sink 2 Japanese freighters attempting to resupply Iwo Jima. He participated in the rescue of Lieutenant James Beckman, a fighter pilot from Enterprise who was shot down over Jima on September 3rd. Beckman was rescued by holding onto Finback's periscope. The submarine approached while submerged to avoid Japanese coastal artillery. Beckman held the periscope for 5 miles until the submarine was clear of the guns and could surface safely. On October 1st, Finback delivered Bush and the other aviators to Midway. Bush flew to Pearl Harbor. He received rest and relaxation in Hawaii. In November, he returned to San Jacinto in the Philippines. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on September 2nd. The citation noted that he completed his bombing run despite his aircraft being on fire, destroyed his target, and successfully evaded capture. San Jacinto continued operations. After replenishment at Saipan, Task Force 38 participated in Operation Stalemate 2, the invasion of Peleliu. In mid-October, the task force attacked airfields and shipping on Okinawa, Formosa, Luzon, and Manila Bay. On October 20th, San Jacinto supported amphibious landings at Leyte Gulf. This triggered the Battle of Leyte Gulf. On October 23rd, 3 groups of Japanese ships approached from the west intending to destroy the American fleet at Leyte Gulf. San Jacinto's task group flew combat air patrol, while larger carriers attacked the Central Force approaching through Surigao Strait. San Jacinto sent aircraft against the Central Force in the Sibuyan Sea. The task force then raced north to launch strikes against the Northern Force. Heavy damage was inflicted on Japanese carriers and surface combatants off Cape Engano. On October 30th, San Jacinto's fighters provided air protection over Leyte. 2 kamikaze aircraft dove on San Jacinto. Her guns shot down both. Other carriers in the task group were not as fortunate. USS Franklin and USS Below Wood were struck by kamikazes. San Jacinto accepted aircraft from both damaged carriers. She received 6 aircraft from Below Wood and 4 from Franklin. The light carrier demonstrated her value. When fleet carriers were hit, CVLS could recover their aircraft and continue operations. San Jacinto arrived at Apra, Guam on November 30th. Air Group 51 was replaced with Air Group 45. Different squadrons, different aircraft numbers. Same mission. On December 14th, San Jacinto supported amphibious landings on Mindoro in the Philippines, attacking Japanese aircraft and shipping. 4 days later, Typhoon Viper struck. Winds reached 69 knots. San Jacinto suffered significant damage. Communications equipment was destroyed. Evaporators failed. Boilers were damaged. 8 aircraft were destroyed. The narrow hull and high center of gravity made Independence-class carriers vulnerable to severe weather. The ships rolled heavily in moderate seas. In typhoons, they were nearly capsized. San Jacinto retired to Ulithi for repairs. In winter 1945, San Jacinto participated in raids into the South China Sea. Task Force 38 entered the South China Sea and launched massive strikes on airfields in Formosa and against shipping at Cam Ranh Bay, French Indochina, and at Hong Kong. By refueling at sea, the task force maintained continuous pressure on Japanese forces while supporting the American invasion of Luzon. San Jacinto witnessed Franklin's near destruction on March 19, 1945. Franklin was operating 52 miles off Japan, launching strikes against airfields on Kyushu. A single Japanese dive bomber penetrated the defenses. It dropped 2 bombs on Franklin, while 31 armed and fueled aircraft waited on the flight deck. The explosions triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. Aircraft exploded. Their bombs detonated. Their rockets fired in every direction. Franklin nearly sank. 807 men died. On March 19th, San Jacinto narrowly escaped destruction. A kamikaze dove on her. The aircraft missed by meters. It crashed into the sea off her port bow. The near miss demonstrated what everyone knew. The light carriers were fragile. A single bomb hitting an armed and fueled aircraft on deck would cause devastation. The CVLs had no armored flight deck. They had limited damage control capability. Their small size meant fires would spread quickly through the confined spaces. Yet San Jacinto survived the war. She participated in Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. On April 5th, over 500 Japanese aircraft attacked, primarily kamikazes. Fighters and anti-aircraft guns shot down approximately 300. Many got through. San Jacinto's gunners shot the wing off one kamikaze, deflecting its dive. They splashed another only 50 feet off her port bow. The ship survived on the skill of her gunners and the protection of screening vessels in combat air patrol. On April 7th, San Jacinto's bombers torpedoed Japanese destroyer Hamikaze. The destroyer was part of a naval suicide attack that included the super battleship Yamato. Yamato was sunk by carrier aircraft. Hamikaze was finished by San Jacinto's Avengers. San Jacinto continued operations through August. She participated in final strikes against the Japanese home islands. After the Japanese surrender, she transported troops and liberated prisoners. She operated in Tokyo Bay in September. She was present for the surrender ceremony on September 2nd. Exactly 1 year after George Bush bailed out over Chi-Chi Jima, San Jacinto departed Tokyo Bay bound for the United States. She arrived in New York on October 17, 1945. She had steamed from the Marshalls to Tokyo, from Saipan to Okinawa, through typhoons and kamikaze attacks. For 18 months of continuous operations, she received 13 battle stars for her World War II service. She participated in every major carrier operation in the final year of the Pacific War. On March 1, 1947, San Jacinto was decommissioned. She joined the Pacific Reserve Fleet at San Diego. She had served 3 years and 4 months on active duty. On May 15, 1959, she was reclassified as an aircraft transport, a VT-5. On June 1, 1970, she was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register. In December 1971, she was sold for scrap. All 9 Independence-class carriers were decommissioned by March 1947. The war was over. The Navy had dozens of Essex-class carriers. The CVLS were worn out. Their hulls were strained. Their machinery was exhausted. They had been built as an emergency measure. They had served their purpose. Only one saw combat after World War II, USS Bataan, the only Independence-class carrier to serve in the Korean War, was recommissioned in May 1950 as an anti-submarine warfare carrier. She was decommissioned again in April 1954. 2 Independence-class carriers were transferred to France. USS Belleau-Wood became Bois-Belleau in June 1951. USS Langley became Lafayette in June 1951. Both served with the French Navy into the 1960s. USS Cabot was transferred to Spain in August 1967, becoming Dédalo. She served until 1989. The rest were scrapped. USS Princeton was the only Independence-class carrier lost in combat on October 24, 1944. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a Japanese dive bomber penetrated her defenses. A single bomb struck Princeton's flight deck, penetrating to the hangar. The bomb detonated among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions followed. Fires raged through the hangar. Princeton's magazines exploded. The light cruiser, USS Birmingham, came alongside to assist firefighting. Princeton's after magazine exploded. The explosion killed 229 men on Birmingham and wounded 420. Princeton was abandoned and scuttled. Princeton's loss validated the concerns raised in October 1941. The conversion of cruiser hulls to carriers resulted in compromises. The narrow hull limited hangar size. Ordnance and aviation fuel had to be stored at the hangar level. There was insufficient space below the hangar for proper magazine protection. A bomb penetrating the thin flight deck and detonating in the hangar caused catastrophic secondary explosions. The Independence-class carriers were never intended to be optimal. They were intended to be available. In late October 1942, after the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, USS Enterprise was the last operational American aircraft carrier in the Pacific. Enterprise had been damaged. If she was put out of action, the Pacific Fleet would have no carriers. The Independence-class filled the gap. They were available when they were needed most. They operated with the Fast Carrier Task Force from November 1943 through August 1945. They provided additional flight decks. They provided redundancy. When Essex-class carriers were damaged, CVL flight decks recovered their aircraft. The light carriers demonstrated that adequate is sometimes sufficient. They were not as capable as Essex-class carriers. They could not carry as many aircraft. They could not sustain as many sorties. They were more vulnerable to damage. They handled poorly in rough seas. Landing on their narrow decks was dangerous, but they could keep up with the fast carriers. They could operate aircraft in all weather. They could fight. They did fight. They fought for 2 years across the Pacific. George Bush returned to San Jacinto in November 1944 after his rescue. He flew additional combat missions in the Philippines. In December, he departed on leave. He married Barbara Pierce on January 6, 1945. He spent the remainder of the war training pilots at Norfolk. He was released from active duty in September 1945. In November 1948, he was promoted to lieutenant. In October 1955, he resigned his commission. He entered civilian life. He became a businessman in Texas. He entered politics. He served as congressman from Texas. He served as ambassador to the United Nations. He served as chairman of the Republican National Committee. He served as chief of the United States Liaison Office to China. He served as director of Central Intelligence. He served as vice president under Ronald Reagan. On January 20, 1989, he was inaugurated as the 41st President of the United States. At his invitation, the surviving officers and sailors who had been aboard USS Finback during her 10th War Patrol walked in his inauguration parade. Commander Robert Williams, retired. Lieutenant Commander Dean Spratlin, retired. Torpedoman First Class Donnet Kohler. Others, men who had pulled a 20-year-old pilot from the Pacific Ocean 44 years earlier, men who gave him a second chance. Bush served one term as president. He lost re-election in November 1992. He retired to Houston and later to Kennebunkport, Maine. He remained active in public life. On October 7, 2006, the 10th and final Nimitz-class carrier was christened. His daughter Dorothy broke the champagne bottle across the bow. CVN-77, USS George H.W. Bush, named for the 41st President and his service to the nation. Named for the pilot who flew 58 combat missions. Named for the aviator who was shot down over Chi-Chi Jima and rescued by a submarine. Bush died on November 30, 2018. He was 94 years old. He had lived 74 years after bailing out of a burning Avenger. He had lived 74 years after USS Finback pulled him from the Pacific. 2 of his crewmen, John Delaney and Ted White, had not. One of them fell to his death when his parachute failed to open. Bush never knew which one. He never forgot them. In his memoirs, he wrote about the helpless feeling of being depth-charged. He wrote about the beauty of the Pacific at night, the flying fish, the waves breaking across Finback's bow. He wrote about the fear and the tension and the adrenaline. He wrote about the debt he owed to submariners who rescued aviators. He wrote about the second chance he received on September 2, 1944. He wrote about the obligation that second chance imposed. Every man who was rescued carried that obligation to live well, to contribute, to make the sacrifice of those who died mean something. USS San Jacinto was decommissioned in March 1947 and scrapped in December 1971. The ship served its purpose. It filled the gap when America had too few carriers. It operated from the Marshalls to Tokyo. It survived typhoons and kamikazes. It recovered aircraft from damaged carriers. It provided additional flight decks when every deck mattered. It was not the best carrier in the fleet. It was not the most capable. It was not the most survivable. But it was there. It was available. It fought. One of its pilots became president. That was not the ship's purpose. That was not why she was built. But it demonstrates what the ship represented. Opportunity. The chance to fight. The chance to survive. The chance to come home and build a life. The chance to contribute to the nation that built the ships and trained the pilots and sent them into combat. San Jacinto was a compromise. The Independence class was a compromise. But in war, compromise is often necessary. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. Good enough was building carriers in a year instead of waiting 3 years for better carriers. Good enough was 33 aircraft instead of 90. Good enough was a narrow deck and heavy rolling and high accident rates. Good enough was being there when it mattered. On September 2, 1944, a compromise carrier launched a compromise aircraft flown by a young pilot attacking a heavily fortified island. The aircraft was hit. The pilot completed his mission. He bailed out. A submarine rescued him. He survived. 74 years later, that pilot was gone. The carrier was gone. The submarine was gone. The men who pulled him from the water were gone. What remains is the memory of what they did. The light carriers filled the gap. They did their job. They brought their pilots home when they could. Sometimes they could not. But they tried every day. They tried. That was enough.